Today we're looking at manna. What's it? Recall last time Pharaoh had all the food, and Joseph's people lost their money, their cows, their land, and their bodies into slavery. And a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph, and he feared the number of immigrants in his land. And he made them work harder with less materials to build the king's storehouses of more food. And God hears, God sees, God understands the cries of those suffering at the bottom of the Egyptian pyramid. And God calls Moses to tell Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And then we have a series of plagues, and Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he had no compassion for the suffering of the people. He had a hardened heart. And he'd get a hardened heart, and then there'd be a plague, and he'd say, "Okay, you can go." And then he'd get a hardened heart, and there'd be another plague, and he'd say, "Oh, you can go." I know it's hard to imagine a ruler who didn't care about anyone else but himself and had a hardened heart of stone in the face of suffering of others. But try to imagine it, because that's how Exodus describes Pharaoh, the king of the Egyptian empire. And the plagues are that water of the Nile turns into blood and they couldn't drink it, and there's killing of fish, and then the frogs that overrun the land, and then gnats that infested the land, and flies that covered the land, and then a livestock pestilence. A plague kills all the livestock of the Egyptians, and then boils that afflicted humans and animals, and then hail that destroys the crops and livestock, and locusts swarming and devouring the remaining vegetation, and darkness. A thick darkness fell over the land for 3 days. And then the death of the firstborn of every Egyptian household died, sparing only the Israelites, who followed God's instructions to mark their doorposts with lamb's blood that began the celebration of Passover. And so Pharaoh lets the Hebrew slaves go, has his heart hardened again, changes his mind, and chases after them, but gets his chariot stuck in the mud, and the water drowns them after the Israelites cross on dry ground. Now it's just a few weeks since God has liberated his people from bondage to Pharaoh's economy of exploitation. Liberation is one of the main themes of the Bible, and this is their main story of liberation. And so we pick up with our reading from Exodus 16, verses 1 through 8. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the Sin desert, which is located between Elim and Sinai. And they set out on the 15th day of the second month after they had left the land of Egypt. Now, I've heard the Sin desert called the wilderness of sin, and I used to think that people must have done a lot of sinning in the wilderness, but I was wrong. Sin is just short for Sinai. And in the Sin desert is the desert that you go through to get to Mount Sinai. In fact, we ought to call it the Sign Desert and Mount Sinai, or the Sin Desert and Mount Sinai, one or the other, because they're the same word. And Sinai was where Moses will receive the 10 Commandments from God, where the people gather. And the whole Israelite community complained against Moses and Aaron in the desert. The Israelites said to them, "Oh, how we wish that the Lord had just put us to death while we were still in the land of Egypt." The whole community, everybody, complained against Moses and Aaron. They are facing the unknown wilderness with its uncertainties and changes. And it's only been 45 days, a few weeks, since they've been miraculously liberated from Egypt. And already they're saying, we'd rather have died in Egypt than face this wilderness. Imagine how hard to try something new with all its uncertainties. And do you complain to God? No, you complain to your leaders. You tell your pastor, I'd rather close this church than do something new. It's been around for 5,000 years. And the wilderness desert is a disorientation experience. Walter Brueggemann divides the Psalms into themes of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. It is similar to the theme we have of life, death, and resurrection. Our lives are constantly evolving and growing like creation itself. And the growth always involves orientation, disorientation, reorientation. Every time we face a transformation in our lives. But disorientation time, death time in life, death, and resurrection, both are hard on us. It's not comfortable, but it's necessary for transformation to occur. When you go through a change in your life, it is the hard place of the wilderness between slavery and the promised land. It's the hard place of disorientation between orientation and reorientation to something new. It's the hard place between what we knew, where we're living, and what we hope for. The people continue. There we could sit by the pots, meaning in Egypt. There we could sit by the pots, cooking meat and eating our fill of bread. Instead, you brought us out into this desert to starve this whole assembly to death. While Pharaoh was in charge of who ate, how much we ate, and when we ate, at least we got our fill of bread and meat while we were slaves. Their memory of slavery and the king's unjust economic system means they would rather die under Pharaoh, but at least they die at home, than starve to death in this desert. Before we ever move to what is possible, we almost always cling to the past. As an aside, the phrase for cooked meat is the flesh pots of Egypt in the King James Version, and that's the name of the group that we heard at the conference in St. Paul, Minnesota. The flesh pots of Egypt. And J.D. King's nephew, Jamie's cousin, has the arrow pointing to him, Scott Simmons, and Nancy and I got to visit with him after they played for our closing worship and communion. Find it funny that today we read the flesh pots of Egypt in our Bible, and there they are last Sunday. Then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to make bread rain down from the sky for you. The people will go out each day and gather just enough for that day. In this way, I'll test them to see whether or not they follow my instruction. Bread raining down from the sky is such a great line. I think of baguettes falling all over the place, or maybe a Panera Bread giveaway day. But God is giving them bread to test them. On the sixth day, when they measure out what they have collected, it will be twice as much as they collected on other days. for the Sabbath rest for everyone. They won't work to collect bread on the Sabbath, so they'll get twice as much as they need on the sixth day. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "This evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you will see the Lord's glorious presence, because your complaints against the Lord have been heard." As God is creating this new community, so like the creation story of evening and morning the first day, you will know it was the Lord in the evening, and that Yahweh liberated you and is present with you now in the morning. Who are we? Why blame us? Moses continued. The Lord will give you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord heard the complaints you made against him. Who are we? Your complaints aren't against us, but against the Lord. Moses does two things. He asks, why are you complaining to and blaming Aaron and me when your complaints are really against God? And second, Moses adds meat to God's promise of bread. Meat in the evening and bread in the morning. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole Israelite community, come near to the Lord, because he's heard your complaints." As Aaron spoke to the whole Israelite community, they turned to look to the desert. And just then, the glorious presence of the Lord appeared in the cloud. In order to see God, the people have to turn away from Pharaoh's rule of power and turn toward the desert. And the presence of the Lord is in a cloud. Like the wilderness, you can't control it or touch it. It's a cloud, a mystery, but it's very real, and it's there. The Lord spoke to Moses, "I've heard the complaints of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will have your fill of bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord, Yahweh, your God." In the evening, a flock of quail flew down and covered the camp. And in the morning, there was a layer of dew all around the camp. And when the layer of dew lifted, there on the desert surface were thin flakes, as thin as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" They didn't know what it was. The meat in the evening is quail. You know, quail migrate from the Mediterranean to that area. They get tired. They land on the ground where you literally can pick them up. And likewise, the Sinai Desert fathers of the first few centuries associated biblical manna with the sweet granules found on the tamarisk bush. In June, the bush produces a type of sweet granule on its twigs, and a steady worker can get up to a ½ pound a day. Later, science studies showed that the sappy substance was actually the excretions of 2 types of insects containing 3 basic sugars, resulting from the insect's consumption of the tree sap. It turns into a whitish, flaky substance. I don't know if scientific explanations help you read the Bible or not. You can read the Bible many ways. However, the flaky white substance arrived, the people called it manna. What is it? Because they didn't know what it was. And it didn't look like the bread they might have imagined. God's possibilities don't always look like our imaginations. We don't recognize when God is acting in our lives, and we say, what is it? Moses said to them, "This is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Collect as much of it as each of you can eat, 1 omer per person. You may collect for the number of people in your household." An omer's about 2 pounds, 2 pounds of manna per person per day. And the Israelites did as Moses said, some collecting more, some less. But when they measured it out by the omer, the ones who had collected more had nothing left over, and the ones who had collected less had no shortage. Everyone collected just as much as they could eat. Why did some collect less? Were they handicapped in some way? Were they too old? Were they lazy? For those who collected less, others collected more, so that everyone collected just as much as they needed for that day. In Pharaoh's world, outside the reach of the wilderness, a few at the top did almost no work and had most of the food of production. Some hoarded more than they needed so that others starved. The richest did the least labor. In God's community, everyone has enough. Some collecting more, some less, but everyone having enough. This image of God's community is 5,000 years old. It's beyond our ways of seeing because all we know is Pharaoh's exploitive economic system in our world today. But we still hold on to this vision of God's community where everyone has enough. And we work for that community that Jesus called the kingdom of God in the church today. For Israel, the manna was not only a concrete sign of God's provision, it was also a test of their trust. They were instructed to gather a daily portion of manna, no more, for that which exceeded was actually consumed. If you tried to eat more than you got, it would rot in your hands. You could only eat what you needed for the day. Throughout our history and even today, we worship and follow a God who provides for our needs in daily miracles each day. And God tests whether we will trust God or not, and lets us suffer the consequences of our choices. The question is, do we trust God to provide enough for the day? It's so hard not to plan for tomorrow. But trusting God means trusting here and now, today. And the Lord will provide, as Abraham said in his test of Isaac. Was Jesus thinking of the manna in the wilderness when he taught his disciples to pray in the Lord's Prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread"? Jesus and his disciples depended on God's provision each day as they wandered the countryside, trusting in God. And it's so easy to miss that daily provision if one is not looking for it. And notice, we don't pray, "Give me my bread that I need today." It's "Give us our daily manna, enough for each day for the whole world." God provides enough food in our world to feed the whole world each day. The problem is, a few take more than they need, while too many starve. And God's provision and our taking too much includes so much more than bread. How do you trust God to provide enough for you? For several years in the mid-1990s, Nancy and I went on a backpack trip in Colorado with Brian Butler from this church and senior high youth from our presbytery. We carried the food we needed hiking in the wilderness for a week. We learned something about trusting God to provide what we needed daily. But in 1997, snowdrifts covered the trail ahead, and we couldn't follow the trail. It was buried under our feet of snow. We had to leave the trail, which is a frightening thing to do in the wilderness. Without our trail as a guide, how would we keep from getting lost? We followed a stream, which led back to the trail at the bottom of the mountain. God provided for us in the wilderness, and we found our way forward. It wasn't what we had planned, but it was what God provided. In John's gospel, Jesus says, "I am the bread of life, come down from heaven." Is Jesus our manna that feeds us daily? Remember that in Jesus' time too, people would take bread and break it off and dip it in a common bowl to eat their meals. So bread wasn't just some food. Bread was how you got your food, the rest of food. Jesus is how we get what we need from life. Maybe we don't know as much about Jesus being bread as we know about the fact that we are hungry. We know a lot about hunger. We know that gnawing pain in the heart of our soul. I know lots of people today who are hungry, but not just for bread. People today are hungry for meaning and purpose in their lives. What's really important? What matters? What does the future hold? How can I be a better person with a better life? People are so hungry that they're willing to believe almost anything. People are so hungry that they're willing to spend all kinds of time and money to get spiritually fed, only to still go hungry. And we can identify with these people because we hunger for better relationships. We hunger to be better parents and better children. We hunger to make a difference in our world. We know what it's like to hunger for liberation from all the injustice and systems that make the rich richer and the poor poor. And I believe we are here in this church today because we are hungry. We are told the church is full of hypocrites who act like Christians for a couple hours and then act like they don't follow Jesus' teachings the rest of the week. Have you ever heard that? The church is full of hypocrites? I don't go to church for that reason? Well, I give you 3 answers. 1, there's always room for one more hypocrite, so come join us. 2, well, at least they get a couple hours of the week right. And 3, maybe the problem isn't hypocrites coming to church. Maybe it's the problem is that we go home. But anyway, we come to church not because we're great Christians who have it all together. We come because there's a need in our lives. And we are hungry. And we are needy. And we come to be fed by the bread of life. And there's only one kind of bread that will truly satisfy the hunger of our souls. And that's Jesus. The bread of life which satisfies you when nothing else can. Like delicious bread, take time to enjoy Jesus. Come Sunday after Sunday to get nourished for the rest of the week. In the ordinary reading of Scripture, praying of prayers, singing of hymns, preaching and listening to God's voice, we are fed with the bread we need. Jesus, the bread of life, comes down from heaven. He happened to be born in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem literally means the house of bread. Jesus, the bread of life, is born in the house of bread. Finally, I'm reminded of the story about the parable between heaven and hell. In hell, there's a beautiful banquet table filled with all sorts of wonderful food, and around the table sit the people, but they have long spoon handles with which to eat all this wonderful food. And the problem is, in hell, the handles of their spoons are too long. And when they spoon up the food, they can't get the food into their mouths. And as they try to feed themselves, they're unable to do it, and they go hungry, even with all the food available to them. Meanwhile, in heaven, there's the same table with food, and people are sitting around it, and they too have the same long-handed spoons, so they can't get the food into their mouth. But there's a difference. In heaven, rather than trying to feed themselves and going hungry, in heaven, they feed each other. They feed each other.